All right, so we're going to discuss the Cold War and the origins, and then we're going to talk about the home front a little bit too. Interestingly enough, in 1946, after the United States has won the war, they create this freedom train. A lot of it was Truman's idea, and he wanted to contrast U.S. ideals with the tyranny of Hitler and probably Stalin as well. Um, and in this freedom train that was going around the country, you had the Mayflower Compact, the Declaration of Independence, the Gettysburg Address, but there was really nothing about 20th century legislation yet, social movements, or FDR's freedom from want speech. There was nothing really about African Americans except the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, which we've already discussed, and a 1776 letter by a congressman saying that slavery was bad. And also, what ended up happening is it had to cancel its trips to Memphis and Birmingham because those two cities wouldn't allow whites and blacks to meet at the same time. Okay, so we're even in the 1940s, there's still a very highly segregated society in the South and in the North as well. Also, at this time, the United States emerges as the undisputed leader of the world. They alone possessed the bomb right after the war, and they really felt that their security lay in Europe and Asia. And really prosperity meant around the globe, this kind of globalization, kind of Wilson's idea of connecting all of these economies together to promote democracy. But at the same time, you did have the USSR. They were in Eastern Europe and Germany, and it played a crucial role in beating Hitler. In fact, if it weren't for the USSR, Hitler probably would not have been defeated. They lost at least 20 million people, but that's hard to tell because Stalin probably killed 10 to 11 himself, not himself personally, but through purges and through killing deserters and things of that nature. So nobody really knows how many actual people the Russians lost, the Soviet Union lost, but it's upwards in the 20s. Um, and they also wanted a buffer in Germany because Germany had invaded Russia or the USSR twice in the last 30 years. So the Soviet Union was really intent on making sure that Germany would not do that again. And so, as we know, Germany was divided between the winners and a buffer zone was created. All right. In 1946, the former ambassador to the Soviet Union, George F. Kennan, wrote The Long Telegram. And really what he says, and this was published in a historical journal, what he says is basically the Soviets aren't normal. Russia has never been normal. Um, and he says they will expand because what communism is about is world revolution, and the only people who can stop it are the U.S. But he says at the same time you can't completely beat it. So what the United States needs to do is contain it. And so this will be the basic foreign policy of the United States during the whole Cold War is maybe not trying to end communism until Ronald Reagan, but to at least contain it so it doesn't spread. Okay, a little later in Missouri, Winston Churchill will give his famous Iron Curtain speech. There's an Iron Curtain descending on Europe, meaning basically there's a battle between light and dark, communism and democracy. Um, at the same time, because of and right after the Long Telegram, President Truman comes up with the Truman Doctrine. This is in 1947. Uh, to give Truman some credit, he never thought he'd be president, and he was a very black and white person, very good versus evil. All right, there's the United States and democracy, and then there's communism. There's no real gray in his eyes. In 1947, the British had to leave Greece and Turkey due to financial and numerical reasons, and both of these areas were fighting communism at the time. And so when Britain starts leaving these places, they ask the U.S. for help. And this is when Truman says that the United States is the leader of the free world, and its responsibility is to aid anyone who is fighting communism in the world. Okay, kind of sounds familiar to today, right? Anybody who helps fight terrorism is an ally of America. Truman is saying the same thing. 24 times in his 18-minute speech, he used the word freedom. And he goes on to say, at this moment in world history, nearly every nation must choose between alternative ways of life. The choice is too often not a free one. He says it's an ideological war, and he said it's between people who want to be free and people who do not want to be free. So what he does is, this is a speech to Congress, so he gets $400 million to aid both countries. And in the end, both of these countries do end up being pushing communism back. So this really helps kind of fuel this world crusade for the United States. Okay, they win in Greece, anti-communism wins in Greece and Turkey, so the United States feels like it can keep going. At the same time, you get the Marshall Plan, which is a very important. It was ideological, but it was basically keeping Western Europe democratic through economic means. They gave billions of dollars to the ravaged Western European, and they were especially worried about communist parties becoming popular in France and Italy. But this actually worked quite well for the United States. Not only did Europe get rebuilt, which was part of the point, but they also kind of squashed this communist party in France and Italy, because after the war people were so downtrodden, but the United States came in to help. It did rebuild the continent, and it really created a free trade zone in Western Europe for all of American products. This is really, like I've said, this is really when the United States becomes a world power. After World War I, America had already become a world power, almost the world power, but then after the Depression and then the World War, people weren't too sure. But after the World War, this is when America becomes the world power. At the same time, so by 1950, there's this real stark contrast. Just like Truman saw the world, there was black and there was white. There were people who were on the side of democracy, and there were people who were on the side of communism. At the same time, what happens is you get the Berlin blockade. And the Berlin blockade was fairly simple. There's a picture of Germany, a divided Germany, and then a divided Berlin. So what Stalin does in 1949, and this is really when the Cold War intensifies, is he tries to cut off all parts of Berlin from the West. Now, as you can see, Berlin is strictly in the Soviet zone. So not you have Germany cut into 4 pieces, but the capital is in the Soviet zone, and then the capital is cut into 4 pieces. So what ended up happening is West Berlin, on the British, the French, and the American side, they create their own currency. And in response to this, Stalin blockades. So what he does is he cuts off all the roads and railroads from their zones, because it's in the Soviet part of Germany, and he can do that easily. So what follows is an 11-month airlift supplying fuel, food, water, electricity, things like that, to keep West Germany going. Okay, it was very impressive, the whole Berlin blockade. So at the end of 1949, Stalin lifts the blockade, and this is really the first victory for the West in the Cold War. But at the same time, in 1949, the Soviets get the atomic bomb. So what ends up happening is the United States creates NATO, and NATO is still, especially with the ISIS thing that's going on today, NATO kind of lost its glamour after the Cold War, but it's kind of regaining it again. And what Putin's doing in Ukraine and things like that, NATO's kind of an it thing again. But what NATO was is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it's a military alliance of mutual defense. And anybody in the West could be in it. And basically, if you signed it, that meant that if you were invaded by somebody outside of NATO, then the rest of NATO would come to your help, come to your aid. Okay, so it's basically a lot like the alliances that kind of pulled the world into war in World War One and World War Two to an extent. But it's all it is it's democratic country saying, if you are invaded by a communist country, mainly the USSR, then NATO will come to your aid. So, and it's still going on today. In fact, I think Turkey may actually be in NATO today. So it still has its purposes, especially now that Putin's kind of acting like Joseph Stalin. But it was mainly a Cold War thing to kind of make sure that the Soviet Union didn't get too far into the West, because after World War II in 1946, 1947, the Red Army was in Germany. So there were a lot of people, French, Spanish, the British, the Americans, a lot of people felt like if the Soviet Union wanted to, they could have just kept going and taken over Western Europe as well. But they did not. Stalin didn't feel like they could. So there is a lot of mistrust in the world at this time. You just gotta understand what's going on right now. At the same time, in 1949, Mao wins the Civil War in China, and he sets up a communist government. So this is very scary to the United States. He kicks Chiang Kai-shek out to Taiwan, and this is a big blow to democracy, or what the U.S. believes to be democracy. They also do not recognize the government and block it from the UN. And because of Mao's victory in China, we get National Security Council number 68. And this was a 1950 manifesto from the National Security Council, kind of the same thing as the NSA, CIA, people like that. It's kind of after World War II, this is when things like this really start getting kicked off. And it's a 1950 manifesto describing the Cold War as a struggle between freedom and slavery under the oligarchy of the Kremlin. So basically they're saying the USSR was involved in China. That's the reason why China became communist. And if the United States and the Western world does not do something about it, they'll just keep going. It's very Adam Smith-like, saying that the individual in a free country will do what is right for the whole, but if an individual is not free, then it is slavery. So it was really, and it was this wasn't published. This was for like presidents and his advisors' eyes. These are his advisors coming up with this idea. This is not something that was published. It was classified. But really, what it is it was a global crusade against communism. It talks about facing annihilation. The idea of people wanting to be free is the most contagious idea in the history of man, etc. Meaning that this is a fight of ideologies, and an ideology is how you view the world, right? So you either view the world as people who are in a democratic society, or you view the world as people who live in a communist society. So this is really when the Cold War, especially in the United States government, really, really looks at everything in a kind of black and white way. So because of this, things kind of steamroll. So because of China happening, and because of the Soviet Union's power in Eastern Europe, they kind of come up with this domino theory, meaning if one thing falls, then the next thing falls, and the next thing falls, and pretty soon all of Asia will be communist. And then once all of Asia is communist, then the Soviet Union's going to go through Western Europe, and then Poland's going to fall, and then West Germany is going to fall, and then France is going to fall, etc., etc. So they kind of come up with this domino theory, you know, and then they also come up with the strategy of how to stop it. So what happens is the first real hot war of the Cold War begins, and this is in Korea. I don't know if you can tell from this map or not, but Korea after the war was divided after Japan's defeat, because Korea had been taken over by Japan. So after the war, the Allies cut Korea in two, into a North Korea and a South Korea. North Korea was run by the Soviet Union. South Korea was run by the United States, France, and Britain. Even though South Korea was anti-communist, it was quite corrupt. Without going into too much of their interpolitics, even though the South was on the side of America, they were a very corrupt government, as was North Korea. But it's not. South Korea wasn't like this burgeoning beacon of democracy in East Asia, like people thought. So what happens in June of 1950 is North Korea invades the South to unify it. There's a lot of evidence that Stalin gave Kim permission, and this is the current North Korean president's, it would be his grandpa invades South Korea from the north, because then his grandpa gives over. So it would be the current South Korean or North Korean president / dictator, his grandpa. He invades South Korea without supplies or help from Stalin. Stalin just gives him permission. He asks Stalin for permission, and he gives it. They actually get most of the peninsula, and so what happens is Truman goes to the United Nations and convinces the United Nations to fight the war. So this is very important in the history of the Korean War. It was not the United States versus North Korea or China or the Soviet Union. It was the United Nations versus North Korea. Okay? And so as North Korea is moving down south and taking land quite easily, in September 1950, under the United Nations, this is where General MacArthur becomes really famous, is he launches his amphibious assault on Incheon, and he drives them all the way back almost to China in only about a month and a half with the United Nations troops. But in October, at the border, hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers come to their aid, and then the United Nations is pushed back. This is somewhat interesting. We don't need to talk about it too much, but the Chinese soldiers were not part of the Red Army because officially it wasn't an official Chinese helping the North Koreans, because on purpose they didn't wear insignias saying they were part of the Red Army. They were all supposed to be volunteers, quote unquote. So even though a lot of the people probably were in the Red Army, officially China was not in the war. And officially, even though quite a few North Korean fighter pilots were actually Russian fighter pilots flying Russian planes, officially Russia was not in the war. So and this is obviously what they say, this is the forgotten war in America. So the whole thing is very interesting. If you would like to do your project on this, I would very much recommend looking into who fought the war and why they fought the war, and officially who was who. But and another interesting part of this is MacArthur wants to keep going into China, and he wants to cross the Yalu River and keep pushing them. But Truman says, no, we don't want another world war. You have to stop at the border. And so when they do, that's kind of when, with the help of Chinese soldiers, the North Koreans push the United Nations back. And then the war becomes a stalemate at the 38th parallel. And so for the next basically 2 years, they kind of fight this trench warfare type of war where nobody really moves north or south, and then the demilitarized zone is made. And in 1953, an armistice is signed. So the demilitarized zone today is is a neutral area. The war officially is still going on. So it's a really interesting war if you guys want to look into it more. But overall, 33,000 Americans died. Um, at least 1 million Koreans died fighting, and 2 million civilians. It was a devastating war for the Korean Peninsula, and probably close to 200,000 Chinese people died as well. So it's kind of a war that nobody talks about anymore, but it's still a war that's going on today. I believe there's close to 20,000 at some time, 20,000 U.S. troops in South Korea into today, just in case, because the war still is going on. You could also do your presentation on the demilitarized zone. It's a very interesting topic, but that's kind of the first battle between democracy and communism in the Cold War. So, on the home front, as most of you probably know, this really was an ideological struggle for the hearts and minds of people. Freedom became this theme for academics, journalism, mass culture, and even government pronouncements. Um, Hollywood was encouraged to produce anti-communist movies like The Red Menace and I Married a Communist. Um, and they were told not to have bad things in their movies about the past, such as how the United States government treated Native Americans or slavery. Um, it's interestingly enough, because it's hard to imagine, because no matter how much people dislike America today, American culture is the most popular culture in the world as far as movies, music, dress, things of that nature. But at this time, it was kind of a cultural backwater. So the United States sent jazz musicians, African Americans, and other actors. This is where Harry Belafonte comes in, around the world to say how great the United States really is. Um, you also get this whole idea of totalitarianism, right? Like, basically what happens is this idea versus free and not free is inescapable. You get associations, um, churches, unions, things like this, all talk about this fight against totalitarianism. And this is how freedom is defined after the war, whether you are free or you're totalitarian. So basically, whatever Moscow was, then you needed to be the opposite of. Anything with the word socialized in it was bad. Uh, this is when Truman really wanted social health care. Uh, but there was no way that was going to happen, because that would look like socialism. There was no chance. Soviets were also atheistic. That's kind of part of Lenin's communism, and so this is when "Under God" was added to the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954. Okay, so there's just this whole idea of us versus them. Really, there's a really black and white view of the world. Um, at the same time, Truman tries to come up with what he calls the fair deal, because the first task of the United States was to try to transition into a peacetime economy. You got more than 12 million men returning in 1945, and most of these guys just wanted to go home to their families, maybe get an education, maybe not, get a house, go back to their lives, and use the GI Bill to get education loans, small business loans, things like that. But a lot of people found this difficult, and the divorce rate skyrockets. At the same time, you also get 2 million women who lost their jobs because of this, and government jobs also lessen as well because there's no reason for a lot of things that were created, jobs that were created during the war. There's no reason for them anymore, so those are lost as well. And this is why Truman comes up with the Fair Deal. It's basically to improve social safety, the social safety net, and to raise the standard of living for just ordinary Americans. So what the Fair Deal does is he ups the minimum wage. He kind of creates a national health insurance. He expands public housing, he expands Social Security, and he really puts a lot of money into education. Um, at the same time, there's a strike wave because of job loss, and because even though Truman tries to up minimum wage, it's still not enough to live on for a lot of people. So in 1946, just 1 year after the war, because a lot of people had already lost their job, labor militancy takes hold. The AFL and the CIO, whom we've already talked about, launches Operation Dixie, and basically this was a plan to unionize the South because inflation was soaring, and there was a real drop in real income. And this is actually the largest strike in U.S. history. 5 million workers from the steel, automobiles, coal, any type of mining, etc. They all strike. 5 million people, which is huge. They walk off the job and demand better wages. 750,000 steel workers individually strike in U.S. history. Strike at that time. So I mean, it's a huge strike throughout the United States, and this actually kind of creates a somewhat sense of fear because unions are a social thing, and so when you think of unions, you think of socialism, and you think of everybody getting wages, a set wage, this and that, a set time off, this and that, and so this kind of creates a fear in America. And what happens is the Republicans surge. They become popular again. I mean, you got to remember the last Republican governor was, I believe, Garfield. So, I mean, the Republicans had been out of office for a long time. They sweep through Congress, and Operation Dixie fails in the South because the South is not the North. It's not as industrialized. It was still very segregated. There was just too much going on in the South to really get a strong union going together. And really what happens in the South is the Democrats who are voted in are basically Republicans anyways. They're very conservative on a lot of issues. So even though they're part of the Democratic Party, they kind of coalesce with Republicans. And so basically what ends up happening right after the Fair Deal gets passed is Republicans get voted into Congress and the Fair Deal is turned aside. And then in 1947, the Taft-Hartley Act is passed, which sought to reverse a lot of the gains made by organized labor, and it authorized the president to suspend strikes by ordering an 80-day cooling off period. It banned sympathy strikes and secondary boycotts, which were basically actions against people who did business with an employer, not the actual employer, and it outlawed closed shops, which closed shops meant that you had to be a union member to get a job there, kind of like teacher union today. Even if you don't want to be a part of the teacher union, you still have to pay your dues. Even if you don't go to any union meetings or are involved in it in any way, you still are part of it. That's what a closed shop is. And it also authorized right to work laws, prohibiting any type of form of forced membership. And this really actually did hurt unions in a bad way. At the same time, you get this the civil rights movement after World War II really becomes a part of the U.S. dynamic, so to speak. Tr- and in his defense, Truman really does as much for African Americans as anyone else had since Reconstruction. Between 1945 and 1951, 11 states established fair employment practices, and there are numerous laws passed against discrimination for jobs and public accommodations. By 1952, 20% of African Americans in the South are voting again, which is nearly 7 times the number from 1940, just 12 years ago. And for the first time in history, uh, since records had been kept, there was not a lynching in the South. Now, does that mean there weren't any lynches? I don't necessarily know that to be true or not, but there was none on record. And in 1947, you also get this man pictured here who is Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson is there's a lot of cool information about him, and if the movie's actually quite good, the new one that came out about him. And if you want to do your PowerPoint topic on him, you should. We'll just talk about him a little bit. He was a very important person in American history, not just sports history. Um, Earlier in 1944, he'd been tried and acquitted. He had already not moved to the back of the bus in Fort Hood, Texas, when he was supposed to. So he had already had this idea, this kind of persona of somebody who doesn't give in. By the way, he was not the best player in the Negro Leagues, but he was picked by Branch Rickey to break the color barrier because he had the thickest skin, and this is all in the movie and in a lot of other things. Jackie Robinson is one of my heroes, so I know a lot about him. Even though he became a Hall of Famer and he was a very good baseball player, he wasn't the best in the Negro Leagues, but they picked him specifically because they knew he could keep his cool, and they knew that he could handle all the racism and the spitting and the booing and the things being thrown at him and the hatred of his own teammates. They knew that he could handle it, not being able to eat at the same restaurants that his teammates could, things like that. They knew that he could handle that. Um, and he had also served in the army, so there was that. Um, so he will not come in up until the 1950s, but by 1947, he's already in the Negro Leagues, and they're already thinking about desegregating baseball, which is an important thing because baseball is still America's game. I mean, just think if the NFL was still all white today. Think if the first African American ever, or minority in general, was allowed to play in the NFL today. Think of how. I mean, it's hard to imagine today because of, especially our sports are so they're so diverse. All our sports teams, it is hard to imagine. But at the same time, it's an interesting topic. Um, Also in 1947, with Truman, he launches this commission to really look into what's happening in the South as far as segregation. Um, there was this really big call, especially from a lot of northern people, for the federal government to abolish segregation. Um, there was this call on the federal government to ensure equal treatment in housing, employment, education, criminal justice, things like that. And many people in the South argued that lynchings were still happening, but that the state or individuals can't stop it, meaning the feds need to come in and they need to do something about it. Um, and at the same time, a lot of these people don't argue that if the federal government steps in, liberty will be squashed, because real freedom, like Voltaire and others have argued, one of my favorites is Voltaire, is having fair laws that are followed and upheld by the government. Basically, the idea is the government is there to ensure the safety of its citizens. Um, and they're there to uphold the law and create laws that are just. Um, Basically, the whole argument is segregation is morally wrong, and this is interesting because by then, since you're fighting communism, America is and the Soviet Union, both sides are good at telling people what is freedom, um, and and the United States begins looking bad in the segregation sense around the world. Okay, because we're sending all these people out saying how great America is, but at home it's still a segregated society in the 1950s. But the first real victory in this whole civil rights movement was the desegregation of the armed forces in 1948. And really, the Korean War was the first integrated army conflict since the United States Revolutionary War. Basically, I mean, the North had African Americans fighting for it, but it was not a desegregated. You had African American units and you had white units. So this is the first. The Korean War was the first time since the the United States Revolution that the country had a desegregated army. At the same time, in the South, you have the Dixiecrats and the Wallace Revolts. In 1948, the Democrats were led by Hubert Humphrey, who was obviously a Northerner because he's from Minnesota. He had the Metrodome named after him, amongst many other things, in Minneapolis and Minnesota. And he is Democratic, and he starts telling the South that you need to walk out of the shadow of states' rights and into the sunlight of human rights. Okay, so the Democrat, and the South is highly democratic, their leader is telling them that you need to stop segregating and you need to stop living in the past and join the future. And so what ends up happening at the 1948 delegation is that the Southern Democrats walk out of the convention, and they nominate Strom Thurmond on the platform for complete segregation of the races. And unfortunately, more people followed him and voted for him than really should have, especially in 1948. At the same time, there's a lot of people who are really far left Democrats who think that Truman was too centrist. So you get another kind of progressive party platform that we've already talked about, led by Henry Wallace. And they're all about social welfare and even more desegregation than Truman had asked for, right? So really you have three parts of the Democratic government by the Democratic Party. You have the far left who say just completely desegregate, and we need all types of social welfare. You have the centrist party like Truman who says we need the federal government to ensure everybody's safety and slowly desegregate the society. And then you have kind of the far right Democrats led by Strom Thurmond. These are the Dixiecrats who are calling for the complete segregation of races, and that to basically move the South not back to slavery, but just make sure that white people and black people don't ride the same buses, don't eat at the same restaurants, don't go to the same movies, that kind of thing. So this is really why the Republicans, not only that, because the Republicans, the scare of communism, this is really why the Republican Party dominates basically until JFK. And we'll talk about that, kind of why he wins anyways. Henry Wallace, who was part of the social welfare and more desegregation, he goes on tour campaigning, and he was physically attacked in the South. He kind of had to stop his tour of the South because it was too dangerous for him, because nobody wanted to hear about complete desegregation and social welfare and things like this. And the real difference between him and the president at all was the Cold War. Wallace wanted to deal economically with the Soviet Union as partners rather than military foes. Wallace said, hey, if we can just put aside our differences and we can help each other economically, then the Cold War will be over, right? And people didn't want to hear that because it was an ideological battle, and when ideologies happen, people get really staunch in their beliefs. Um, and so basically what Truman says is a vote for Wallace is a vote for Stalin. Um, and like I talked about, all of these guys were big threats for Truman to get reelected. But fortunately for him, the Republicans had Thomas Dewey, who would not commit to anything, and he was fairly colorless. So, and he kind of really didn't do anything because he thought the Democrats were too divided to win. So in 1948, Truman dominates the biggest, one of the largest um, wins in electoral history as president. He wins 303 to 189, and for the first time since 1868, African Americans played a decisive role in the outcome. But we also have to realize that the Democratic Party was split, and although Truman won this time, he will not win next time because Dwight Eisenhower will come to the forefront. War hero, charismatic guy. So this is kind of the beginning of the end for the Democratic Party at this time. So lastly, also on the home front, you don't really get a return to normalcy. The military-industrial complex, which will be defined by Dwight Eisenhower, actually becomes permanent. It doesn't go away. National security becomes the reason for a lot of things, including aiding higher education, creating a new national highway system, and this was to speed the evacuation if there was nuclear war. And it kind of encouraged this culture of secrecy and dishonesty. The government begins spending money for sciences, improving aircraft, computers, medicine, and every other everyday products we use. You may or may not know this, but because of the military, you have all these advancements in radio, TV, automobiles, airplanes. All of these industries were basically created and funded by the government for the military, and then they kind of seep down into everyday life in America. And you get this loyalty and disloyalty. Either you were anti-communist or you weren't. And this really is what people start calling McCarthyism. But even before McCarthy in 1950, Truman had enacted a loyalty review board for all public employees to demonstrate patriotism. You also get HUAC, which is the House of Un-American Activities Committee, which really launches its fight against Hollywood, which would bring media attention. Gary Cooper, Walt Disney, Ronald Reagan come to the stand and testify that there are a lot of communists in Hollywood. You also get spy trials. The Time magazine editor named Whittaker Chambers accused Algernon Hiss, a high-ranking official in the State Department, of passing him secret documents so Chambers could give it to the Soviets. Hiss denied this but was found guilty of perjury, and he served 5 years in prison. And really, a California congressman achieved notoriety for hounding Hiss and really sending him to prison, and his name was Richard Nixon. But the most sensational and the Algernon Hiss thing is very interesting. If you want to do your PowerPoint on that, you could as well. But the most sensational was the trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were working-class Jewish communist couple from New York City. In 1951, a jury convicted them of passing atomic secrets to the Soviets during World War II. And their chief accuser was David Greenglass, who was actually Ethel's brother, who had worked at Los Alamos, who worked in the nuclear industry. And the thing about it was the case really rested on highly classified documents that really couldn't be revealed in court, and would later show that probably was too crude to justify passing the secret along, but he did help them speed up their program. So probably they were guilty of sending secrets to the Soviets. The question remains how important were they? This is also something you could do your PowerPoint on, is Julia and Ethel Rosenberg. There's Julius. There's just a ton of stuff about this. Um, and although they were convicted of conspiracy, not spying or treason, they were given the death sentence, and the death sentence was carried out in 1953. As the judge says, what they did was worse than murder or treason, and a lot of that had to do with the Korean War, because he says them passing along nuclear energy information to the Soviets directly led to the Korean War. Okay, so it's an interesting case, and there are people even today who say they weren't guilty. There are people who say today, of course, they were guilty. It's one of those type of things. Also, at the same time, you get McCarthy, um, and this guy's he's a senator from Wisconsin, and he suddenly emerges as this chief pursuer, kind of out of nowhere, pursuer of communists. And in February of 1950, he announces that he has a list of 205 communists who are working for the State Department. And so what he does is he sets up these hearings about this, and he's a fairly charismatic guy. Um, and so he uses these hearings in the subcommittee to bring up charges. He's a self-promoter. He lied about his war record. He's kind of a politician in every sense of the word, right? And so for the next 4 years, what this anti-communist crusade becomes known as, and you've seen in the video, is McCarthyism. Okay, he's the guy who kind of becomes the face of it all. Um, Really, his downfall only came in 1954 when he charged that the army had harbored and coddled communists. So what happens is in 1954 there's these televised Army v. McCarthy hearings, and it kind of reveals him as this bully who kind of browbeats witnesses, and he starts making sweeping claims with no evidence. And really, as we'll see, TV becomes very important in United States history, especially along, the Vietnam War and who gets elected as president. This is really the first time that people in America are watching things in their home, and they saw that he really bullied this young lawyer who was who was defending the army, and everyone saw it. So after 1954, he's condemned by the Senate for this, but the word McCarthyism has kind of entered our vocabulary as the shorthand for character assassination, guilt by association, and abuse of power in the name of anti-communism. This is also something you can do your PowerPoint on. This is a very embarrassing time in American history, much like the internments of the Japanese people. This is a time when you could go after communists, so to speak, in quotation marks, just by accusation, not with any type of evidence at all. And the real face of all of this was McCarthyism. And really, what he does is this whole era, the 1950 to the 1955, creates this atmosphere of fear. You get you get teachers who are required to take a loyalty oath before they're hired. Pharmacists, communists, quote unquote, couldn't get fishing licenses, driver's licenses. And even in India, you couldn't even Indiana, you couldn't work as a professional wrestler if you were a communist, believe it or not. So there's this whole idea of fear, which is basically what Stalin was about, right? Creating fear, and if you tell on your neighbors, then you won't get in trouble. The only way that you can stay alive in the Soviet Union is to tell on people, and so this kind of becomes the culture of America. Not necessarily every single American, but there is this sense of, are the communists going to come and take over our country? When is the nuclear war going to start? Things like that. And a lot of this has to do with McCarthy and the whole anti-communist push. And it was useful. This this anti-communism becomes very, very popular with ethnic groups from Eastern Europe, where the Soviet Union was. Polish people, Czech people, Slovaks, people who a lot of Hungarians. They look to the West. They know that the United States is anti-communist, and they're living under this communist blanket, and this kind of anti-communist movement becomes popular in these areas. And with religious leaders throughout the world, because you know Lenin's idea is that at some point religion will just kind of be a thing of the past. It's Marx said it's the opiate for the masses type of thing. Um, and really, since America is still one of the most conservative countries in the world into today, and one of the most religious Christian countries today, uh, not Muslim but Christian countries today, this really takes a toll in America, and it really takes hold. What happens is the FBI uses all of this to expand their power, especially under J. Edgar Hoover. So what happens is the FBI, this is really when the FBI starts creating all these files on citizens, even if you weren't communist at all. It became, this is a way to identify labor unions. It was a way for the government to kind of intervene into the economy. Many in the South used it as a backdrop for racism, against homosexuals, against feminism, not just the South, this is everywhere. Um, and they really say anybody who's, not like us is eroding our country's fighting spirit. You also had a fear of immigrants, even if these immigrants had children who were either citizens, or the immigrants became citizens themselves and also had children who were citizens. You still have this fear. Um, and so in 1954, because of all of this fear, you get the government launches this Operation Wetback, which is a very derogatory statement today, but it was an actual operation. It employed the military to invade Mexican American neighborhoods and to round up and deport illegal aliens. So what the government was doing is saying, if you are not a legalized citizen, then we are going to deport you. Okay. Within a year, 1 million Mexicans had been deported. Um, and the whole thing kind of showed that even though not everything was terrible going on in the United States, there were a lot of breakthroughs in the civil rights. I mean, you got Jackie Robinson, you got African American culture pervading our society in American society in all kinds of ways, through music, movies, things of that nature. There were a lot of good things that were happening in America at this time, but at the same sense, it also showed that in some places in America, things hadn't changed that much, even after fighting Nazism, even after doing a lot of things, a lot of good things for the world. At home, some things weren't as well as they should be. Um, but and also at the same time, this kind of idea of anti-communism kind of takes the forefront, and civil rights kind of takes a back seat to this. Pretty soon, this impulse for civil rights doesn't stay in the background much longer. That was only temporary, and so and the rise of what we'll talk about is the affluent society. Um, will give way to kind of this idea that whites in the South deserve more than African Americans in the South. But at the same time, when that happens, the civil rights movement will start to flourish, and we'll see by the early 1960s it's somewhat of a well-oiled machine and really starts changing America for the better.